Hey class, as I've explained before, a lot of the writings that have survived from the Middle Ages are religious in nature. So while, yes, we're talking about religion, we can't escape it, and we won't escape it for a long time because it's really not until English 242, so part 2 of this course, where you get into like the Romantic Victorian period, that religion really starts to fade some. So even though it won't be a focus for future literary movements, it still impacts it, which means that we kind of need to understand some of the cultural and intellectual movements that are happening in the Middle Ages in religion and around religion, to understand how literature is going to move forward and why decisions are made. I also want to note that a big turning point in the cultural and intellectual movement of the Christian church happens in the Middle Ages, which is a really important movement in terms of what happens to Christianity further on, but then also in how some different things come out in literature and art. And if we don't talk about it now, it might feel a little weird and you might be a little confused. So this video is just designed to give you that background. So we are going to have to talk about Christianity. We are going to have to talk about some of the doctrines of Christianity to make you understand it. But again, it's to help you understand the literature we're going to discuss and read. I don't want to leave you just hanging like, what's going on? So that's what this background is for. So a visual representation of the god or gods in most religions is very important, right? It's not just in Christianity where you have visual symbols or images. Thinking about maybe like the Hindu faith where they have beautiful, colorful images and statues and stuff like that as well. It helps, the devotees, the followers connect to their god or gods. So that's not the new thing that's happening here. However, when we get to the Middle Ages, the way that we have our visual representation of Christ and God is going to have a massive change. So up until the Middle Ages, at least part of the Middle Ages, Christ and God were seen as these conquering warrior kings who there is a distance. So think about Jeremy the Rude, Christ is very triumphant and a king, and he's there, and we're celebrating him, but his suffering isn't really highlighted too much. He's kind of there, and we're here. So what changes in the Middle Ages is that gap is going to close, at least in the literary and visual artistic realms, and then with some theology. So Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who was also the Archbishop of Canterbury before he died, is responsible for clarifying the idea of atonement in a way that it's now used in modern Christianity. It's just kind of like the norm accepted. However, previously people thought they had to kind of do like works to earn salvation and stuff like that. At least that's how it was happening in the Catholic Church at the time. And St. Anselm explains the idea of atonement and the idea that humans have to reconcile with God because of their sin, and there's only two ways for that to happen. One, God completely ignores what all sins have been, or two, he takes on the burden of sin himself and pays the bill by himself. So, because of this, Christ comes to earth, becomes human, atones for everyone's sin, and dies. That's atonement. That's St. Anselm. That may not seem revolutionary if you think about Christianity today and if you've been in the Christian faith. And really, it does fit with the Christian doctrines. However, what became revolutionary about that is it allowed people to really view Christ as a sympathetic, relatable person, as a fellow human who had suffered alongside with them. It really invited people to really focus in on that suffering aspect of Christ. So, at that point, not all, but many depictions from here on out of Christ are of him suffering, sagging, lacerated body with a very human God, right? That's how we see him. He needed to be human to understand what it was like to be human and feel that pain of those he was coming to save. So while there may be some images of the hero warrior Christ, the king triumphant, He is very human and very real at this point. And helps people feel like they are physically present in the moment of Christ's suffering, but also allows them to just see it a little bit better. It does, in a good way, then help give wider spiritual experiences and spiritual access. If people just have to be able to sympathize with Christ, if they just have to be able to imagine his sufferings and feel that emotional impact, they can interact with their religion more than previously. They don't have to know all the doctrines, all the theology, all the like higher order thinking. They just have to be able to feel for Christ and experience those emotions. So more people are having it. It also led to, because more people are engaging with it, it leads to the establishment of the Feast of Corpus Christi by the Pope in 1264. So the Feast of Christ's body, the Feast of Christ's corpse, right? Celebrating that crucifixion and that suffering. You get the Franciscan Friars being founded in 1223, where their goal is to live in earthly poverty to imitate and respond to Christ's own suffering as well. So this just grows and grows and grows, and is felt everywhere. In Christianity today, these visual and written representations, detailed, intense images of the suffering is not as common because of the Reformation. The Reformation really does has a strong push of removing all those kind of like images and symbols as much as they can, so it doesn't cause idolatry of an image versus worshiping the real God. Like it just kind of like removes some of that, and things kind of calm down a little bit in terms of we're not just the emotional suffering. So that's where sometimes we might feel like this is a little much as modern viewers. There is a female impact of this as well. Women don't have a lot of power or say or control or anything at this time, and they're kind of really restricted to what they can do. One editor says you're either Eve, you're a temptress, full of sin, way over there, or you're like the Virgin Mary. Okay, so that's kind of like the two roles the church saw women of having, as being able to have at this time. So you can imagine many women were trying to be more like the Virgin Mary, so that way they're not being judged, right? Well, this change in views allows women to engage more with religion and go further and explore more where they could feel that emotional impact. And it also allowed for female writers, not that there's many, but they could have some because they could claim they've had a vision from God and therefore the authority can't be questioned, versus previously where they didn't have the education and they didn't really have a voice. A subculture of this movement is affective piety or piety, and it does have its origins in this push of recognizing Christ as a sufferer, and the atonement doctrine that people were really grasping onto for tightly now. But they really focus in on being present at the crucifixion and having all the very strong emotions. So like having the image and really like putting yourself into that moment. And I have my eyes closed to kind of give that idea of like they were fully immersed in that, right? And all of the emotions that came out of it, and how did it affect them, and how do they feel? So it is very emotional, intense scenes, images, descriptions come out of this. But it's not just always negative emotions. Sometimes your intense joy at like the gift of salvation out of this kind of thing. But this is a very emotional and intense subculture going on at this time. And it's very common for a lot of the women writers. Not limited to them, but is common for them. But one negative emotional outpour from this led to a rise some in anti-Semitism, because if you're imagining yourself there in that moment, you could get a lot of hate towards those who you view as being the issue and the ones who put Christ to death, which were the Jews who took him to Pilate, right? So that is a downfall of this, is that yes, they're experiencing emotion related to religion better, but it also led some hatred in other realms as well. So as we're reading and you see these emotional outpours, just remember that there's good, there's bad. It changes how we view Christianity. It really impacted literature because, as your Norton editor said, readers and artists of this time are centrally preoccupied with the bodily representation of Christ. So it's going to be everywhere. And they're really hyper focused on it.